Well, let's see if we can make Kant a little bit more understandable by dressing him up in some 20th century clothing. Let's take John Rawls, one of the great political philosophers of the 20th century, who in his work, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971, argues basically from a Kantian perspective for his thesis that justice is fairness. Not a very exciting position in itself, but how he gets there is really interesting. What Rawls does is to start from scratch. He asks hypothetically, how would we build a just society from scratch? So he's within the tradition of social contract theorists in political thought, who take society to be something like a deal that people make with each other to give up certain freedoms for basically for security. This assumes, all contract theorists assume a moment when there is no society. They call it a state of nature. And then there's an agreement initially, and then society is created out of that agreement. So Rawls is in that tradition. His contract is purely hypothetical. He calls it the situation of this initial moment when we're deciding what kind of society we'll have as the original position. This is the initial choice situation. Now, how are we going to do this practically? He says we're not going to have a plebiscite to decide because we're not organized yet. So what we do is to choose a handful of people, the choosers, maybe because they're wise or fair or whatever, and they will decide for us what kind of society we'll have. They are included in society, but they're going to decide for everyone. We have an initial problem here that how do we know that the choosers aren't favoring themselves? Very important to note that Rawls assumes that everybody is self-interested, including our choosers. So naturally, they're in a very powerful position. They get to decide the structure of society, what kind of political system we'll have, what kind of judicial system, what kind of economic system, and so on. So they could decide to build a society around themselves. They're just a handful of people, the choosers. We'll have an oligarchy. We'll be in charge. So presumably we've chosen them because they're fair-minded. All right, let's assume that they are fair-minded, but they are self-interested. How can they know themselves? How do they know that they're not subconsciously favoring themselves? A very natural thing to do in such a situation. Here is where Rawls gets really creative. He imagines what he calls the veil of ignorance. Imagine something like a voting booth, which when our choosers go into it and close the curtain behind themselves, they forget everything about themselves, all of their personal characteristics, which might tend to bias them against the interests of other people. Now, this is a good exercise. What would the choosers need to forget about themselves? So you might want to stop the video and think about this, but if we would do this in class, the list is pretty consistent from one class to another. Once we get the ball rolling, you'll see, so age, so they don't know how old they are. In fact, Rawls is writing at the beginning of the environmental movement. So he allows that the choosers don't even know if they're born yet. This will account for justice between generations. They don't know their ethnicity. They don't know their gender. They don't know their social position, where they are in society, including their income. They don't know their mental and physical capacities. So you get the idea, I think. All of these are all characteristics that we have that determine most of our interests and separate us from other people. So to choose fairly, they must forget all of this. Rawls also points out that they need to account for their preferences. Most of our preferences are based on the characteristics we have. For example, we tend to like to do the sorts of things that we're good at, whether that be athletics or something else. But there are other preferences which do not seem to be based on our other characteristics and are simply raw data. I don't know. A lot of our taste in food comes from our upbringing, but then there are other tastes in food that we have which seem to be just raw data, not based on anything else, like taste in ice cream or something like that. So we must account for those because some of them are considerably more serious than taste in ice cream. What does this mean, really? That they don't know about these characteristics that they have. It means basically they don't know who they are while they're making this decision. How would they choose then? How do they choose fairly, in particular? They don't know who they are. So once they come out from behind the veil, they will know who they are in society and how they'll be affected by the choices that they made. So they are self-interested. Rawls allows this. How do we allow them to make self-interested decisions, which are also fair? This is the beauty of this. Rawls has a particular view on how he thinks the choosers would proceed. He says, the rational thing to do in this case, if you're a chooser behind the veil, is to imagine that your enemy is able to determine where you will be in society. So you don't know where in society you'll be, at the top or the bottom. So your enemy has that ability, but you get to organize society, its institutions, its structure. Rawls believes that what we have here is basically a maxim indecision. That is, minimize the bad. That's the aim of a maxim indecision. That since your enemy determines where you are, that could very well be at the bottom of society. So it's in your interest to organize society in such a way that the bottom position is the least bad possible. You don't even care about what comes above the worst. You want to make the worst position the least bad possible. What is it? Okay, so why are we doing Rawls? What makes Rawls a Kantian? Well, what we have behind the veil of ignorance is essentially Kant's rational agent. Remember how we got to the rational agent? He said, what law should our rational agent prescribe? It says, what law should there be? What law could I reasonably expect others to accept, since it has no sanction behind it? There's no punishment for them to accept it because they're rational. Well, I'm rational. What law could I accept? And we collapse that distinction between everyone else and ourselves, that all we have is the rational person, and it doesn't matter who you are. That's the effect then of the veil of ignorance. Except Rawls strips off those characteristics. And Rawls also, he differs from Kant in allowing that we are self-interested. Kant says, does not acknowledge this. We're simply rational for Kant. So what we have here is capacity to have fair decisions which are also self-interested. Let's take an example. Imagine that you have a pie. It's your favorite kind. You get to slice it, but everyone gets to take a piece before you. You get the last piece. You're self-interested. You want to maximize your share. What's the most rational way to slice the pie to ensure that you get the largest likely piece that you can get? And of course, the answer is equally. It's beautiful. You get fairness out of self-interest under these conditions when you don't know who you are. This is a very important concept in ethics, generally in ethical theory, and practically also. We'll consider this next when we look at the concept of universalization.